All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Glad you were able to join us today. Hope everybody had a wonderful Thanksgiving. I'm Phil Brink. I'm the consulting coordinator of the Colorado Cattlemen's Agwater Network, and we're still having some folks join us. But while they're joining us, I'll just give you a little background here. Today's webinar focuses on dealing with drought on the ranch. And our presenters are Erika Murphy and Jeff Meyers, and they are the owners of Coyote Creek Angus Ranch just south of Hayden, Colorado. Coyote Creek Angus has been challenged with drought conditions in the last 3 out of 4 years. So Erika and Jeff have become experts on dealing with drought. They probably don't really like having that distinction, but they've kind of had to be. And so they're going to be talking about how they have adapted their operations in the face of chronic irrigation water challenges and precipitation challenges as well. This is the first webinar in a series of 5 webinars that Colorado Cattlemen's Association's Agwater Network will be hosting this winter in cooperation with Colorado Association of Conservation Districts and the Natural Resources Conservation Service. This webinar series is designed to help ag producers, conservation district staff, and board members and other stakeholders stay informed about water-related issues that affect agriculture in Colorado, including drought response, wildfire mitigation and recovery, water rights, water storage, and interstate compact compliance, specifically in the Colorado River Basin. So we'll be talking about those things in upcoming webinars. Just a little background on the Agwater Network. The Agwater Network was created by Colorado Cattlemen's Association and the Partners for Western Conservation in 2015, so about 6 years ago now. And it was created out of concern over the increasing loss of irrigated ag land in Colorado. So our mission is all about helping to keep ag water connected with ag land. And we accomplish that through outreach, webinars like today's, as well as meetings, workshops, presentations, and then collaboration with like-minded organizations like CACD and the NRCS. We also have technical resources and assistance with on-the-ground projects that improve irrigation efficiency and provide other stakeholder benefits. And by the way, all of our resources can be accessed at our website, which is agwaternetwork.org. It's agwaternetwork.org, and I'll show that at the end when we're done with Erika and Jeff's presentation. If you have any technical challenges that you're experiencing, you can go ahead and call the CCA office at 303-431-6422. And we can probably put that number in the chat. It's 303-431-6422. Or you can email Erin at coloradocattle.org. That's ERIN at coloradocattle.org. As far as questions for the speakers, we hope that you have some questions, and we think we're going to have enough time to answer several. Please go ahead and you can type those in the chat box at the lower kind of center of your screen, and we will get to those as soon as we can after the presentation is over, and we'll get to as many as we can. Today's webinar is being recorded, and it will be posted on our website later, along with highlights of the webinar. So if you find somebody that wasn't able to connect to the webinar today, you'll be able to send them the link and they'll be able to watch it later. Okay, so now we come to the real fun part where I get to introduce our speakers. And Erika Murphy and Jeff Meyers own and operate Coyote Creek Angus Ranch, which again is located south of Angus, Hayden in the Yampa River Valley. Coyote Creek Angus, this program focuses on 2 key goals: raising quality, high altitude Angus cattle and being good stewards of the land. And Erika and Jeff raise Angus bulls and heifers that are bred to thrive in mountain environments. And they sell their seed stock to other ranches across the Intermountain West. They also work hard to use sustainable practices throughout their operation to make the most efficient use of their water and grass. And one other thing that I should tell you about Jeff and Erika and Coyote Creek Angus is that in 2020, the ranch received the Seed Stock Producer of the Year Award from Colorado Cattlemen's Association. And by the way, there are a lot of good seed stock producers in our state. So it's quite a testament to Jeff and Erika's ability to both produce excellent beef cattle genetics and use sustainable practices that preserve and enhance their resource base. So one other thing, I think Jeff and Erika were featured in a the fall 2020 Angus Journal. So they've had a lot of attention these last several months. So I think at this time, if you guys are ready, Jeff and Erika, if you could go ahead and share your screen, give that a try. Okay, great. And we see your screen. It looks good. So if you guys are ready, you can take it away.
Well, thanks, Phil. That was a very nice introduction. We appreciate that.
Thank you very much. Thanks for being with us today. Phil introduced us as experts. I don't know. I feel like anything but an expert. It seems like every year we have to work hard to learn how to run this ranch and get better at it. So I'll start maybe with just a little background. Coyote Creek Ranch, although it hasn't always been known as Coyote Creek Ranch, but it was founded about 135 years ago. We're not completely sure the exact date that the Dunkley family homesteaded here, but we know that the first brand was registered to William Dunkley in 1885. That, of course, is the Dunkley family name for Dunkley Park south of Hayden. The base elevation of this ranch runs from about 6,900 to about 8,000 feet. And Phil mentioned in his introduction that what we're really trying hard to do here is raise high altitude Angus seed stock. We work towards a set of balanced genetic traits, but that also include cardiopulmonary capacity to work well at elevation. So the bulls and heifers that we sell are in the Intermountain West, from the northwest edge of Wyoming down to Alamosa, Colorado, into central and south central Utah, and occasionally into the highlands of New Mexico. If we have a bull running anywhere below 6,000 feet, it's probably an accident. We specialize in selling breeding stock to high altitude operations. The most years we irrigate around 130 or 140 acres here out of the Fish Creek drainage, and every so occasionally out of Yost Creek, which is a tiny little ancient creek on the very north edge of the ranch. And the nominal stocking rate for this outfit is between about 100 and 120 cows over the course of time. We've been here 17 years. We've probably averaged about 105 or 106 registered cows. We've been much higher than that at times, up to 122, 123 cows. We've been a lot lower, which we are right now, and that, I guess, brings me to the main point. Over the course of the 135 years that this ranch has been in operation, it is kind of a little agricultural productivity powerhouse, really. It's back in the day, it was really well known for commercial Herefords. That was the livestock of choice in this part of the Yampa Valley. Through looking at all of our numbers and going over that with our county extension agent and trying to be as realistic as we could, without going into a lot of detail, based on the number of cows that we can run today and the hay that we raise today, we know that Coyote Creek Ranch is probably 70 to 75% as productive today as it was in the 1970s. So 50 years ago, this ranch was 25 or 30% more productive than it is today. And that really gets down to just one thing, and that's precipitation. I guess you could make the argument that maybe we don't know what we're doing, there's probably some a pretty good argument there at some level. But for the most part, it's just hydrology. It's a drought and a sustained one. And all the gated pipe and cross fencing in the world doesn't put more water into Fish Creek, and that's the present reality at Coyote Creek Ranch here. So I think that's probably as much as I need to say to lead into Erika's introduction to management in the drought.
So we're going to talk about it today. I mean, we don't have all the answers, and certainly a lot of other ranches are doing the same things. I don't know if there's anyone out there that has something amazingly mind-blowing that we would love to hear about, but we're just going to talk about what we're doing specifically, and maybe it can relate to and help others at some level, or certainly validate what other people are doing. So Jeff mentioned we've been here since 2006, and we kind of looked back over the years, and I think we kind of picked out the drought years that we were affected by. So probably the first one was in 2008. Then 4 years later, 2012. And when we talk about drought, we're talking mainly what's happening in terms of both snowpack and then precipitation, rain that should come in the summer months. And then we had kind of a localized drought here at the ranch in 2018. We were kind of known as the donut hole. Everyone around us got rain and snow, but we did not. So we were affected here locally. And then certainly 2020 was a pretty bad year. And then this summer again was quite bad. We had actually okay snowfall last winter, but then it never rained at all this summer. So then of course, is that going to happen again? And the current trend, looking outside at this beautiful fall day, we're starting to worry about snowpack again. So we rely on snowfall and rain, and we have one main creek that runs through the property called Fish Creek, and it has 3 ditches that come off of it, and that's how we irrigate. So looking at it as a whole, we took a look at kind of 4 key areas: hay planting, pasture management, irrigation improvements, and then our cow herd in terms of management and stocking rate. So those are the 4 things we'll talk to you today about. So on the hay planting, we raise about 200, well, we irrigate and hay about 220 acres depending on the year. And recently those years have fallen. And so we've turned actually some hay ground into pasture just to kind of help our stocking rates and how we plan. Because of the long winters here, we have always had to buy hay. And so for us, we have a local hay broker that we use every time. And that consistent relationship has really helped us. He has, in the years where there's been phenomenal hay and prices are low, we haven't ever paid the low price. But on the other hand, in the years where hay prices were pretty astronomical, he's been always very fair to us. And so, you know, it's been an average over time, but it's that relationship he's always come through for us. And when others called him at the last minute for a one-off year, you know, he was loyal to us. So that, I think that has been an important relationship. The other thing we do is we use alfalfa because it is available here. It's grown locally in the river bottom area. And because we can get it, and it's one of the first crops that they'll harvest in the summertime, we buy that, we contract for it, and we are quite careful about getting our orders in early and locking those rates in. That is again a good and bad thing, but at least we know what we're getting. And then on the alfalfa end, you know, it's nutritious. We supplement our hay with that. We're really careful how we feed that out to the cows, but you know, it has worked quite well for us. And so the only point there is, you know, we're taking advantage of what is available to us locally. We don't have silage. Other views may be able to leverage that, but whatever we can get, we'll take. In 2021, our hay broker was very clear and said he did not have any hay and was not going to have any hay. It was so bad up here. So we ended up contracting with some folks out on the Front Range because, of course, they did have the rain. They were fortunate to get it in the spring. And we did contract early again in June. So the prices on the hay were decent. It wasn't the greatest hay, but the prices were all right. Of course, then we ended up paying for transportation. But again, we felt like we were ahead of the game compared to other people who waited till later in the summer. And then we also contacted other states with some resources in Utah and Wyoming to see if they would have anything, just because you never know. Sometimes it's local and people do okay. And so leveraging that network has paid off.
The second area, and an extremely important area of management focus for us, is pasture. And I suppose everybody that within the sound of our voice here has to think long and hard about pasture management during a drought. We do plan and use rotational grazing, not in a real intensive sense in some meadows, but one of the limitations here at the ranch is we try to have live water in every pasture. So where pastures don't bound the creek, we have built water breaks or little fenced off areas down to take cattle down to the bottom, and that access to water can sometimes limit a real intensive rotational grazing plan. But we do like to get the cattle off the meadow and get a good regrowth if we can. So we plan in advance, and that little spreadsheet that you see down there is just an example of how we try to think about the number of AUMs per patch that we can operate here and rotate those around. My wife's famous comment about my grazing plans is, why doesn't the grazing plan ever work? And of course, it doesn't work exactly the way I draw it up. And that's, I guess, the point I want to make there is it really makes it's a good idea to plan and figure your AUMs out for pasture, but it's also a good idea to keep your eye on the weather and look at the grass. And so when she says the grazing plan doesn't ever work, she's right. We're always altering it and modifying it as we go. One thing that we did here at the ranch this year that I think really helped us, and it's kind of a small thing, but it shows, I guess, that sometimes small things amount to can be important. We have about 5 smaller meadows here, or 6, that we typically dedicate to horse grazing, and those pastures are patches there from a couple 3 acres to 10 or 12 acres. And this year, because we anticipated really being short on grass, we managed the horse grazing very carefully there. So we turned horses out and then we brought them back in. We let them have about 4 hours a day instead of just turning them out and letting them eat everything that we wanted. It's also the case that a lot of our horses have some age on them, and so it was really better for their health as well. But what that did do is a couple of those larger patches, it really let us preserve a pretty good stand into the fall. And then that helped support our cattle rotational grazing, because we had a 10 or a 12 acre spot that we could run cows into for 5 or 6 days while we managed our rotational grazing planning. So it was a little thing, but it really ended up giving us a lot of flexibility and really helped us. Another little thing that we did this year that I don't know why we hadn't thought of before, but we were really working hard to minimize erosion as much as possible. So our boss really clamped down on me and on the ranch hands driving on the grass when we didn't need to, really limit that and make sure that where we had stock bound in the creek, that we really watched for erosion and paid as much attention to that as we could. And I think that was another small thing, but it did have a good impact on our pasture management practices this year.
So I think we're like a lot of folks ranch wise where we're dependent on leases in the summertime as well. This ranch did not come with a forest permit or BLM permit. So we have been relying on private leases through the years. And those are hard to come by as well. But what we ended up learning kind of in the process over time as they came and went were the leases that certainly we have a few that we can we pay an AUM rate, and that works well. But in other cases, we worked with the landowner and we did more of a bartering thing. So where it was a win-win for them and us. So for example, we have one lease where we traded fall pasture, and in exchange, we did their harrowing and aerating of their meadows because they didn't have the equipment in the area and we did. So they felt that was a good trade. In another case, we have a lease where we put the cows, the early calvers on it, and they can be there because it's lower elevation. The grass comes in faster than where we are. They can be sent out ahead of time. And in that case, that gentleman is a outfitter and we give him the rights to hunt here in the fall in exchange for that pasture. So there are other examples of that, but those are the two that worked for us that were, not based on dollar amounts. And then we also feel like, I know a lot of us do this, but we feel like it's a good thing to be a really responsible leasee. So we checked our cattle often. We helped fix the fence. When our cows, if they got out, we would be there promptly to put them back in. And just so that, those owners welcome us back so that they didn't feel like we were taking advantage of them, or we managed our cow herd as a result. And of course, leases can be risky and tenuous. We've had those over the time where they, need to be sold, or they're selling the land, or they just decided they didn't want cattle there anymore for ag status or whatever reasons. So we've tried to get them in writing if we can. And then if not, then we're just really clear. We make sure that if it's a gentleman's agreement, we're both very clear what the lease terms are, and everyone's in the know about that.
So one thing for sure that we have experienced, and I know we're just talking to people who have the same experience, drier conditions have led to weed and pest troubles. And this ranch in particular, there are kind of three areas where, two areas really where we've had to focus. The first is in weeds. We have a couple of really difficult noxious weeds here. We have some species that are less prevalent, but the two big ones for us are hound's tongue. That's that picture down there in the lower left with the purple flower. That's probably our worst enemy. It's if you've experienced this plant, those purple flowers seed out. They turn into a little watermelon seed looking deal, watermelon size seed with spines on it. In fact, our understanding is that the guy who invented Velcro was looking at a hound's tongue seed when he thought of the idea. These little babies stick to everything. They stick to your dog. They stick to the horses and cattle, the elk and deer that come through here. And so the weed itself is not particularly difficult to kill, but it just spreads so fast because a hound's tongue plant can produce up to 400 seeds, and they are very, very durable. The seeds may not necessarily germinate next year. They can be in the ground dormant for 3 to 5 years. And another thing that makes that weed very, very difficult is it germinates asynchronously. So it's not like some weeds that you see them in the spring. You can go across a little patch and chop or spray all the hound's tongue you want and come back 2 weeks later and there's dang plants there because the conditions were just right and some seeds germinate. Our second weed species that's difficult for us, and everybody has this, I know, is thistle. We actually have 4 varieties of thistle up here, and that's of course a fall weed, or we try to deal with it in the fall. But dry conditions are a chance for those weeds to outcompete the grass, and that they just require that much more management when it's dry. So from our standpoint, we feel lucky that I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, we finally stumbled onto a really good aerial spraying outfit in Craig, Colorado, and they're very cost effective. They can cover country along the edges of the pastures and meadows where the brush and the timber starts, that it's just difficult to get to with your own equipment. They just do a very cost effective job. And I always say that, you know, if it were World War II time and Houndsung were the Nazis and Thistle were the Italians, we're the British fighting away as best we can. But when we got the aerial sprayer in, it was the United States Army. They came in and really turned the tide of our war with respect to weed management. Now, we still have to spot spray. It takes a lot of diligence. You can never let your guard down when it's dry, because those weeds are very aggressive. Mother Nature's working 24/7. But the aerial spray technique sure made a big difference in our operation here. That little pest that you see there in the upper right hand corner, some people refer to them as gophers. That is a Wyoming ground squirrel, and Wyoming ground squirrels are spreading as the drought conditions grow. Those gophers, those ground squirrels, are spreading as well. And this is the part of the presentation where we try to minimize profanity. I have a bad habit of talking about these animals using terms that my mom would not necessarily approve of, but I'll do my best here. Just let me say it like this: the Wyoming ground squirrel is your enemy. It turns out that our elevation here at the ranch is an ideal one for their habitat. These animals seems to really thrive well from about 6,000 to about 7,500 feet. You'll notice in pastures at the ranch that go above about 7,500 feet, you really don't see them that much. But in that sweet spot, they're aggressive, and they're colonists, and they multiply. So I always enjoy it when I hear wildlife advocates and biologists talk about how beneficial gophers and squirrels are to the habitat. If there is a benefit, I don't know, providing a food source for raptors, maybe. I guess that's about the only thing I can think of. These things are terribly destructive. They compact the soil. They eat a very high volume of grass. It's shocking how much grass one of these little guys can consume. They can make irrigation difficult or even impossible in flood irrigation conditions. If you're not familiar with this animal, they are basically a carbon copy of a prairie dog at about 60% the size. And one of the significant differences, they burrow, and they have very extensive burrowing systems. But one of the differences, prairie dogs tend to want to create the outlet for their burrow where it's flat. And you see mounds out in the prairie and stuff like that. These little guys are very content to dig into a hillside or a slope. And that means that they are very happy to burrow into your ditch bank. And you can just imagine the havoc that something like that can cause. So they make irrigation in places very difficult, and they prefer dry ground. And so it's just one of those things that has to be managed. They create hazards for the stock, and one of the worst things about them is that their most effective natural predator is the badger. You often see a badger trundling down the road right at dusk with a ground squirrel in their mouth. They burrow into the ground squirrel burrows and eat them. But of course, they make great big holes. So where the ground squirrel burrow is 3, 4, 5 inches wide, you know what size a badger burrow is. And this is really a topic we could probably spend a half an hour on that. I think sometimes people think when they hear me talk about these things, they wonder why Jeff is on this big old rant. You know, they've driven along the county road and seen a couple of them on the edge of the highway or the edge of the county road. But if you have not experienced what 50 or 60 of these animals can do in the corner of your hay meadow, then that's when you have that attitude. Once you have that experience of an infestation, you know that they're a really important management aspect of the ranch. So, you know, there's a lot about timing that we could talk about. We shoot and we invite people to come and shoot as safely as possible. And when we shoot in particular is in the spring. These animals emerge when there's still snow on the ground. The males tend to come out 7 to 10 days before the females, and there's typically still snow on the ground. And so for that first 3 or 4 weeks, it's a real important time to shoot because you can help to suppress the population. Suppressing the population is a lot better than reducing the population. Once you get a hatch of these things, population reduction can be difficult. We also irrigate them if there's an area in a meadow where we find them in irrigated ground. We really try to focus and concentrate. And our experience is that if you can flood those holes once, some of them will drown, some of them will leave. They may come back, but if you flood that ground more than about twice, that they don't like that environment, and typically they're gone. And we have been reluctant here to poison because we have nesting golden eagles at this ranch, and of course we have our dogs and things. So we've been reluctant, but there are safe ways of poisoning them, and there is a timing around poisoning that we've found that can be more effective or not. So again, that's a short introduction. I am happy to talk about this with anyone who has questions. Phil will be sharing out our email. I'd be more than happy to talk to you about any of those techniques. Sometimes if you have an infestation of ground squirrels, you can feel like that's just overwhelming. But the idea is to remember SIP, shoot, irrigate, and poison. You got to do everything you can do to manage that population.
So the next topic for us is on irrigation management. As we talked about, we have 3 ditches that come off Fish Creek. They're all very long ditches, miles up valley from us. We do have several sheep ranchers that are upstream from us that share that creek as well. So because of that, we have, as I said, there's one ditch that we have the water outright, and then the 2 other we do share with them in terms of the water amounts. So we've worked really hard at having a good relationship with our neighbors on those shared ditches. And because those ditches are long, instead of sharing by amounts, we actually try and do it by days, and that has worked well for both them and us. For example, on one ditch, we have a right that's a 60-40 split in terms of the water. And so instead of, again, and we all kind of start irrigating about the same time, but so out of every 10 days, we will get the water for 4 and they will get it for 6. And so we both get equal amounts of head then, and really can irrigate a lot more effectively and beneficially. And then over the irrigation season, as the water runs that down, so we start in the spring with all 3 ditches running and flowing, and trying to get at least across all of our meadows pretty effectively once. Then as the water drops, because it has over the last many years, that and the rain hasn't been coming, we start consolidating. So then we'll put the water into 2 ditches and irrigate as much as we can with that, and then ultimately 1 ditch, and then then it's gone. So but that has really helped. And then we kind of target where we need to in terms of which meadows need the most water, which ones got, based on orientation with north and south and sun exposure and that kind of thing. But just trying to eke out as much water as effectively as possible has been kind of the goal.
Yeah, and I guess speaking of effectively, I think probably the thing that we've done in the last 5 years that's been the most effective improvement is to implement some gated pipe. This ranch has been traditionally irrigated just out of dirt ditches, but we have used gated pipe in places to replace very steep, erosion-prone ditches that it was hard to get the water out of and hard to maintain, and to improve takeouts where we move water from a bigger ditch into a lateral. So you see some pictures here of 3 projects that are probably darn close to mildly interesting, and I would love to tell you specifically about each of them. But I think the main thing is this: the gated pipe helps us to improve the control of water, and that is especially true in low flow conditions. So if you've irrigated out of a dirt ditch with a canvas dam, you know what it's like when the water drops, you don't have quite enough. Sometimes it can just be really impossible to lift that water out of the ditch. That doesn't happen with gated pipe. No matter how slow the flow, you can reduce the number of gates that you use and really move that water around. And I think for me, especially, that makes the efficient use of that water resource while we maintain the benefits of flood irrigation. I'm a big believer in flood irrigation benefits for the ecosystem as a whole. I know from a crop perspective, you can be more efficient with some forms of sprinkler irrigation, but flood irrigation in terms of return flow and riparian areas and keeping water in that creek over the course of the entire year. I think so we can be more efficient using gated pipe and still maintain flood irrigation. When we do that, there are some things that you have to think about. You need to make a transition from the ditch to a gated pipe. Here you see a picture of us forming up one of those, what we call them, splash boxes there. It's a transition from a gravity ditch to a gated pipe. There's one of Erika's dogs there as well. So that's a thing that you kind of have to plan for. You need to plan around the labor of whether you have to pick up the pipe after the irrigation season. In some cases, we do pick up the pipe where we're grazing those hay meadows. Where the pipe lays along a fence or is tight to a fence, we sometimes decide not to. But if you don't pick that pipe up and it's in the middle of the meadow, certainly you're going to have some breakage. And then you have to think about screens and filtration. If depending on the crop residue in your meadow and manure residue, you may need to screen the pipe, and that may vary year to year. So you have to sort of think that through. Among the lessons that we have learned are these. It's definitely a low pressure system. Gated pipe is just a slip fitting. It's just a bell end coupler with a gasket, and you slide the pipe together. So where you are experiencing a lot of fall, and of course in some cases we're using the pipe for steep ditches, then you really have to think about inline valves that you can control some of that pressure, because it's difficult to drop more than about 4 or 5 feet of head just with the gated pipe without being able to control that flow some. And then last, I would say pad erosion control is just a very important aspect of this. If you don't, we learned after our first project that if you don't have a way of controlling the pad erosion, you're just kind of trading one form of erosion for another. So just a couple quick things here. When we do close a ditch with the dozer, we harrow that pad down, harrow it, try to harrow it as much as is practical. And then we seed that with an irrigation pasture mix and cover it with an erosion control blanket. You've probably seen these things on the side of the highway They're a little bit pricey for what they are. They come in about 110-foot rolls. Typically, they're 8 feet wide. So when you're making your pad, if you can avoid making it any wider than 8 feet, cover that seeded irrigation pasture mix and then put your pipe down on top of the blanket. And what it turns out that there's just enough moisture leakage and flow around that gated pipe that it does keep the erosion control blanket fairly moist. You can see a good example of that in that picture on the lower left. Unfortunately, I don't have an after picture, but if you looked at that meadow today, you would really see a nice stand of Timothy there, because the pipe stays moist enough, it can get that irrigation pasture, get that irrigated seed bed to really come back. So pad erosion control is important, but it can be done.
So one other thing, just on that topic, when we do have certain areas in the ranch that have don't have irrigation access directly. So we have also used the idea of a pump and a big sprinkler system, so we can take water from one of these pads or the irrigation boxes, and then we pump it to the area where there is no irrigation and try and water it with the sprinkler, a big sprinkler. And that again has helped in areas that normally would get it from rain. Trying everything we can is basically the point there. Okay, so then on the herd management end of it, again, we are certainly not the only ones in this situation, but we, to be good stewards of our land and make sure that it is sustainable going forward, with the unknown of what's to come in terms of moisture, we have had to consider herd reductions. So we did reduce down when our first kind of localized drought happened, kind of the last 4 years in 2018, and we dropped down to about 90 cows. And then in 2020, we cut again. We took about another 10 pairs this time off the herd. And this year we decided, really sadly, not to keep our replacement heifers. And so normally we keep between 10 and 15 of those, and those went we sold those to other people. So not an easy thing to do, certainly for anyone, but for us as a seedstock operation, it certainly meant a lot of things on top of just the emotional end of it, because we're losing our genetics. Those genetics have been built up over the years. We worked pretty hard at those genetics in terms of raising quality cattle that thrive in these mountain environments. And you can't just run down to the sale barn and replace that equivalently. Well, maybe you can, but likely not. And so, again, it's kind of a big loss for us in terms of what animals thrive here and who's been acclimated. We bought some females years ago and brought them to the ranch, and they never did as well as the females we raised here. And then of course there's a loss of revenue. So over time, as your herd reduces, as you know, your calf crop is less, and so we're selling less animals as a whole, and that is a direct effect as well, and not an easy one. When we looked at the cow herd in terms of who was going to be cut, we looked at several things. And of course, as a seedstock operator, we have a lot of data on these animals, but regardless, we would encourage, I think a lot of people have knowledge of their cow herds and what those animals do and how they perform. So for us, we looked at their expected progeny differences, or their EPDs, their statistics on how they perform here at the ranch. And then their pap history. So if they were producing their own pap history, their calf crop pap, and how they did as well at elevation over time. The age of the cow, obviously. So the older cows typically were more on the cutting block than the running age cows. And because our primary product is bulls, we do sell some heifers, but bulls are mainly what we're selling. We looked at, when we were selling pairs, cows that had heifers by their side as kind of rose to the top as well. And then based on numbers, we kind of calculated what they would be eating in terms of hay and pasture, and that's how we came up with the numbers, per year that had to go. So again, not an easy thing, but something that is absolutely necessary to keep going in terms of moisture and drought if that continues. So I think, yeah, that is pretty much what we had to present today. We're hoping that obviously the answer to this question is not correct and that it is not the new normal, but given again how this winter is progressing, we'll just have to see. So I think we're good. Phil, if you have any questions, and we thank you for your time.
Okay, thanks guys. Great job. Yeah, I mean, I kind of marvel at how much thought you've had to put into this, and every detail matters. And it's obvious that you guys have used a lot of just trial and error and testing to kind of figure out what works and what doesn't. I have lots of questions. I would encourage anybody that's been watching, if you've got a question, just go ahead and type that right now in the chat box. It should be down in the kind of the lower center of your screen. But in the meantime, if we get some questions, we'll jump into those. I've got a couple. One thing I thought was really interesting on the rodent control, and Jeff, I know you love this topic, so I'll start with you. You mentioned that if you can flood an area where they're kind of colonizing a couple of times, that will pretty much keep them out. And I guess you meant for the kind of the rest of the season, but I wondered how long do you have to flood that area for that to work?
Well, that's a good question, Phil. And I'm just sort of speaking from experience, from our experiences. So this isn't a real scientific sort of answer, but we have had anecdotally places in the meadow where, for whatever reason, maybe being short on water and maybe that wasn't a focus, we just sort of created a strip or a small area where squirrels were able to infest. And when we did that, when we focus on that the following year, typically when we flood, you do drown a few because they'll go in their burrow from the wrong end or whatever and panic. And we know that we kill some that way. Typically then they will vacate the hay meadow and you just won't see them. And then but within a week or two, when it dries out, they'll come back. And so we're only flooding them at about the same pace that we would irrigate the hay, Phil, to answer your question, I guess. But when we cycle back through and irrigate that ground a second time, if we can get those same burrows good and wet, typically that does it. That will cause them permanently to relocate out of the meadow. It seems like they sort of tolerate one event, and some percentage, I don't know if it's half, but some percentage of them will return. But if you flood that same location again, that typically is enough to do it and they'll be gone.
Okay. So yeah, I guess it's a question of whether if you don't have the water, you've got to be really judicious about where you apply, but that in some cases might be an effective tool, right? That might, kind of allow you to not have to purchase as many, pesticide products, or maybe not have to have as many shooting sessions. We've got a question from Steve Wooten. Do you use a risk management like PRF to offset revenue lost due to drought? And you might explain what PRF means. I'm not familiar with that acronym.
We do not. We haven't. We kind of look at our revenues based on the number of sales we've had, and ironically, there have been years where we've had drought years, and we thought, the bull market would be low, or not as needed, but we have typically sold out every year, and we set prices. We try and be pretty fair about the prices relative to the given environments for people, but so there hasn't always been a direct correlation to our sales on the bull end and what's happening in terms of drought years. I'm not sure, that's not really answering the question, but we don't use that methodology in terms of risk assessments, no.
Okay.
But Steve, that's a darn good question, and it's probably especially for the commercial cattlemen, it's probably an avenue that's well worth exploring. We haven't, but that doesn't mean that risk management and drought protection in that form wouldn't be a good thing. It sure would be.
Okay, and we got a question from Chris Collins. Are any of your summer grazing pastures irrigated? And if so, what is your typical stocking density? It sounds like that varies, based on the year and things.
Yeah, I mean, we have for example, the hay meadow right in front of our house is what we use. We calve in the summer. I don't know, we specifically said that because again, that's also been a change in our practices that has helped with the drought management. And we sell long yearling bulls as a result of that kind of calendar, but we now use it for calving. And so depending on when our first calf crop or when our first AI calves are going to start, we try and irrigate that meadow several times, and then we'll stop, and then we'll put the cows on there.
I didn't really get the question. I'm sorry.
Oh, it's about the pasture, and if we irrigate some of the pastures and what our stocking rates are. So that's really the main pasture that we use for. That used to be hay meadow that we irrigate and we pasture now. The rest of them are hay meadows, and the other pastures are all dry land and not directly irrigated.
Okay, so I'm just going to contradict my wife, and which as we all know,
never happens.
Perilous step. We do have, Chris, we do have one fairly flat hay meadow down along the county road that we call Yost Creek. Is about 45 acres. And that is kind of a swing meadow for us. Erika kind of forgot about that, but it's kind of a swing meadow for us. So in a real wet year and a good year, when the mountainside pastures are strong, we typically hay that. And in a year when they're not as strong, we typically try to get the water across it one time. And we have an adjacent dry land and sub-irrigated pasture to it. So we'll try to get the water across that thing one time, let it dry as best we can, then rotate the cattle onto it. When we get to about half the grass volume that we started with, the old adage of take half and leave half, when we get to about that point, then we rotate the cattle back out to that adjacent dryland meadow, and we try to get that thing irrigated again. So that definitely does help us manage stocking rate because being a seed stock operator, as Erika explained in detail, we don't have quite as much flexibility at changing the numbers of cows and calves. There are some things to think about when you use a hay meadow in that way. And one of the things that we did there, Chris, was we developed a spring. There was a kind of I don't know if spring is probably not even the right word for this thing, but in most of the year when it's wet, and certainly if you put any irrigation water out there at all, we can fill a stock tank at the bottom of that meadow. So that helps us because we have a tank, and we can water cattle, and we can cross fence that meadow to make use of that. And so it gives us some flexibility. But it's a good idea and a good point if you have the right kind of configuration in your topography, that you can use that meadow either for grazing or for hay.
Okay. And on the meadows, what practices do you use to improve soil health?
That's a good question. We rarely use an external fertilization source. Most of our fertilization, we try to manage our feeding pattern in the winter because we do feed hay for nearly the whole winter. So we look at places where the stand may be weak, or where the soil may be compacted, or where we have weeds. And we select in advance the 5 or 6 places where we're going to feed cows over the winter. And that's probably one of the key ideas. We have used external fertilization at times. The trouble that we have with that is we're so weather dependent here that it can be tricky to predict in advance where we need to fertilize in an external way. So we don't exactly look at it like that. Instead, we sort of say, where's our stand weak? Where do we need help? Where do we have weed populations, and we use feed in that way.
Okay, pretty much just rely on the mobile fertilization sources, and that's a pretty effective,
Yeah.
pretty
I mean,
effective
and
way.
we do spread manure. We have manure piles from the horses. We have quite a few horses here, so we use that as well. You know, we spread that out as much as we can, and then we, as we said, we harrow and we aerate, and that's pretty much it.
So there's a lot that goes into putting that pipe in. You have the harrowing and the seeding and the erosion control blanket and the pipes. And then sometimes you're going to need splash boxes and even valves in some cases. A lot of costs there, a lot of work. Do you have any sense for what that would be, kind of on a running foot basis for other folks that might be looking at doing something like that?
Well, there are several considerations. So for one thing, if you're in a spot where you don't really need to close the ditch, where you can just lay the pipe maybe below an existing ditch, then you don't have as much dirt work to do. So that's one thing to think about. The pipe itself is the biggest external cost, of course, and it's going up. I mean, we've learned over the years that where we put in 12-inch gated, we could have got by with 10, and where we put in 10-inch gated, we could have gotten by with 8. So that's one thing for sure. You look at that big old ditch and think, boy, I need a big old pipe, but because the pipe is just that much more efficient, you typically you don't. So if you're not sure about pipe sizing, it's a good idea. If you don't have experience, it's a good idea to get some help with that, because that can help reduce the cost. But just to give you an idea, the 8-inch gated pipe that we bought in 2020, we paid $2.60 something a foot, Phil. And the 8-inch pipe that we bought
I'm thinking
in the
three.
spring of 2021, we paid $4.02 for. So pipe has gone up a lot, and that's some pain for sure. Probably all in, if you look at your excavating costs, we like to build our own splash boxes because it seems like every one of them has a little bit of a different constraint. That's not a huge cost, but probably all in, it's pretty easy today to spend, $4.15, $4.20 a foot if you need, 8-inch gated pipe.
Yeah, that adds up pretty fast, but it sounds like from the standpoint of what you get out of it, a much more efficiency with your water and with your distribution. It's worth it. There's a lot more questions we could ask, but unfortunately we're going to have to wrap it up. I did have one kind of final question for you guys. As we've mentioned, you've been dealing with drought now really 3 out of 4 years. And of course, drought is always frustrating and challenging for livestock producers. It's pretty much tough on everything, but have there been any good things, any benefits that you have observed as a result of the changes you've had to make due to this prolonged drought?
That's a really good question. I would say 2 things off the top of my head here. One is that at the cow herd level, we felt like we've always had good cows and good genetics, and we worked really hard at that. But given that we had to cull, I feel like now we have an exceptional cow herd in the sense that we've really kind of looked at the numbers and we got rid of the cows that, didn't perform nearly as well as maybe the ones that we have left. So at that level, we're now, looking at the upper crust of our cow herd and going forward with that as a basis. Maybe the other quick thing is, given the need to really spread your network around to find hay or other things to help with mitigating drought, our network has really increased, and we've met some amazing people along the way. So now going forward, we have a lot more resources that we can turn to or rely on, or at least ask questions about as a result of that.
Those two things are really good. I guess the only thing maybe I would add to that, Phil, is that the improvements in management practices that we have made, and irrigation is a good example. Those help us during drought. They're going to help us even more when weather is normal and we have normal precipitation. So I think, what we've learned and what we've tried to do, and I think Erika said it at the beginning best, it's not like we know everything. We don't. And there are probably many of you could fill in the blanks of some of the things we could do better. But those things that we are doing better, I think, will persist, and they'll help us when the weather's good, when times return to normal.
Okay, great information. Thank you so much for sharing that. We will have to leave it there because we're kind of out of time. Special thanks to you guys, to Erika Murphy and Jeff Meyers of Coyote Creek Angus Ranch, for sharing those insights on dealing with drought on the ranch. And again, if you have any general comments or questions about today's webinar, you can contact me, you can contact Aaron.